What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving into 3 starter decks that I do think that you probably could upgrade if you wanted to right now in standard when it comes to MTG Arena. We recently got the 2022 starter decks that we got for the updated rotation that comes out in September. All these decks include cards that will be future proof in the sense that when rotation happens, these starter decks will still be playable in both Alchemy and regular standard. Overall, I would say it's still a little early to speculate on what deck is really going to be the top meta deck overall in the meta when that develops. But I do think, if you're looking to upgrade maybe one of these decks, I do think starting with these 3 decks out of all of them are probably the safest. And if you're someone who's been playing Magic Arena for a while, maybe you may have an idea of which ones they may be. But in today's video, I'll dive into 3 of them. I'll be talking ways to go through them and actually go ahead and upgrade them. It's definitely one of those things. I do think, new players see these decks that they get for free. They have free cards in them, and they do think that, some of these decks can be upgraded and played at a little bit higher level by adding some more rares and maybe some other cards that the decks don't give you overall. With that being said, let's just dive into it and let's just talk about it. So here we are in the deck selection screen, and in the more recent updates, we got this additional tab for all the new starter decks. So this is kind of one of those things that I didn't notice when I was doing my free-to-play challenge, that these decks got added, I think, around the time of Baldur's Gate. But because this whole section is separate from your actual main deck list, this is where those starter decks will live in the foreseeable future, I guess, unless they change the way they organize the deck list area. So each of these are the decks that they kind of gave you. We got the 5 basic monocolor decks that you start off with from the color challenge, and then you also get the dual decks that you unlock after you complete the color challenge from the daily quest. So there are definitely some interesting decks here. I do think there are some decks that just right off the bat, just looking at the pictures of the deck boxes, definitely are playable. And looking at them, the 3 that stand out to me is one going to be Ignite the Forge, which essentially is a Rakdos Anvil deck. And I don't know if they maybe looked at what the meta kind of has, deck wise, and thought about it, and they decided to go with the Rakdos Anvil deck, which is definitely one good deck to upgrade. The other one being is going to be On the Hunt. This is another werewolf deck, and werewolves are definitely I remember from last time rotation happened, werewolves are definitely pretty good, and they were pretty popular pretty early on in standard, and possibly maybe one of the top decks when rotation does happen there. And then the other one is going to be Stealthy Subterfuge. It is the ninjutsu style deck. It is a little bit more of your tempo deck overall, and even though Dimir Ninjas is probably somewhere sitting around a little over 50% overall win rate, it could get a boost when rotation does happen, as maybe the more powerful decks that are in front of it right now may slide out of the way, and this kind of tempo-y style deck could prove to be pretty decent overall in the future. So with that out of the way, the other thing you may be wondering if you're a newer player is you can't actually edit these decks. So if you want to change cards in here, there's no way to really edit up what is happening here. So the one thing you have to do is when you get back to the starter deck screen is you actually have to click this button here that says clone deck. You highlight the deck you want to edit and you click clone, which is what it's going to do is going to create a copy and then move it into your regular deck list. So as you look up here, you're going to see a bunch of decks that you would have for your various decks that you may have in your collection. And as you can see here, we do have the 3 decks here, as those are the 3 decks I do think that are definitely upgradable and possibly even playable in current standard once you do make the upgrades. I don't know how well they're doing right now, just because these decks are all built for rotation in mind, so they are playing with half of the standard card pool currently. So it does limit on how powerful they are against maybe some of the more top meta decks or just decks in general in the play queue and even the rank queue. So it's definitely one of those things that's hard to tell, how the base starter deck is performing. But the overall upgraded version of these decks at least are all sitting above 50%, which is definitely a good sign if you're looking to build a deck that is more upgraded. So definitely that's why I do think, even without really too much playtesting, I do think these decks are worth upgrading in that sense. So with that out of the way, we're going to dive into the first deck and actually go about upgrading the first deck. And I'm going to go through the process of showing you what I would cut and what I would actually add. As you kind of notice here on my deck screen, you do see that I have the 3 decks that we're about to upgrade pre-built with rotation in mind, but I am going to go through the steps and then we'll kind of show the final product throughout the whole process so that you guys get a better understanding of how that all works. Alright, so the first deck up on the list is going to be our Stealthy Subterfuge deck. This is our Dimir Ninjas deck. Definitely a pretty decent deck, I think, overall. There's definitely a lot of good cards here. They definitely gave you a nice assortment of rares that definitely help with ninjutsu, as well as even giving you Kaido as a planeswalker in the deck is definitely a nice boost. He's definitely a good planeswalker now, and I'm sure he'll get even better come rotation. So definitely awesome that they included that. Just right off the right off the bat, you know, you look at all the cards that are in here, I do think the one thing that does stand out that doesn't really feel very ninja-like would probably be like these enchantments. As much as they are from Kamigawa as well, I feel like enchantments just don't really work because we want to make sure we have our ninjutsu cards in the deck. So the one thing I would probably cut first is probably, you know, these enchantment cards. As long, you know, as much as they're good and they maybe help, you know, overall initially, these are cards that definitely just don't fit in the end version of the deck. So we're gonna cut those. We're gonna add them to the, we're gonna just make a pile here on the side of all the cards I would cut. Another card I would cut is probably the Ambusher. It is a 3/2. You can ninjutsu it out for 2 mana. It does have lifelink, but the main cost of it is 4 mana. But we gotta, you know, cut some cards to kind of make space for additional cards we want to add to the deck. So this is definitely gonna be another card we want to cut out of the deck. After that, we have the Moon Snare Specialist. Yet again, another good card. Has a little bit of, you know, bounce in effect with the ninjutsu ability if it does deal damage to the player. You know, it's not super necessary, as I do think we have other ways, you know, once we upgrade the deck to kind of have ways to either remove creatures or just kind of be able to still get in evasively without them really having, you know, them having us to really bounce a bunch of things back to the battlefield. So we're gonna get rid of that more than likely. Looking at the 3-drop slot, you know, we have Umizawa, we have Kaito, we do have Hero's Downfall, we have Bite and Palm Ninja, we have Prosperous Thief. This pile here is actually pretty good, and I do think that's a keep. Then we go into the 2-drop slot. We have the Silver Fur Master, which is essentially our ninja slash rogue, you know, lord that gives all our other rogues and ninjas +1/+1, which is good. It itself has ninjutsu of 2, so we can cheat it out, and it also has, it makes all our ninjutsu ability cost 1 less. So this is like the perfect card for a deck to really make the deck work very well. So this is definitely a keep in that regard. After that, we have the Inkrise Infiltrator. You know, it is a ninja, it is a human. It doesn't have ninjutsu, so we can't cheat it out early, and it does have, you know, a mana sink ability, but it's not really great. This is more of like a limited card, if anything, just because these mana sink abilities really don't perform very well in, you know, a standard style area of combat. So we're gonna probably get rid of those. After that, we have Fake Your Own Death. Yet again, a pretty interesting card, but you know, it's more of a combat trick that you probably maybe see in more of a limited style format, not something you probably see in more standard. But yet again, it's a cool card. You know, when this creature dies, returns to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control and create a treasure token. We're not really trying to attack into stuff and having our creatures die in that process. Sure, we could use it in the idea of if our opponent uses spot removal and get our creature back regardless, but you know, we're not really trying to attack into things at the end of the day. So this is probably a card that, you know, is cool in theory, but just doesn't work with what we're trying to do with the deck. After that, we have our Doom Silencer, and we also have our Moon Circuit Hacker. Both good cards. You know, the Moon Circuit Hacker is definitely a card you can keep in the deck for quite some time. It is a 2 mana 2/1, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card and discard a card. If it's the turn and enter the battlefield, we just draw a card. So definitely a card you could probably keep in for a while, but for now, we're just gonna kind of move it to the side as a, you know, probably this is one of the last cards you're probably gonna cut from the deck, I would say overall. And then we get into the 1 mana slot. We have our Thousand Face Shadow, which is a good card. We have our Faded Hopes, which are great. We have our Network Disruptor, which is amazing because it can tap things down. If we have a creature in our way, we can tap down a creature, and then, you know, it's also a 1 mana 1/1 flyer. So overall in itself, it's still a great card that allows us to kind of get that initial bit of damage early on in the game. And then we also have March of Wretched Sorrow as another great spot removal spell. This is definitely good because you can discard cards of, you know, black color and make this cost 2 less to cast, so then we can do bigger damage to target creature, our planeswalker, and then we gain that much life. So definitely a great card that we want to probably keep in the deck. So definitely, you know, that's kind of where we go with the creatures. Oh, I kind of forgot this guy. We have the Shadow Walker, 6 mana 5/5, you know, ninjutsu of 4. Not yet again, not a bad card, but it is kind of expensive. We want to kind of keep our mana open because what you want to turn the deck into is a little bit more of a tempo deck, just because ninjutsu is kind of more of I attack in, I do an ability, maybe leave some mana open so I can react to what our opponent's doing. So, you know, not bad early on, but I would say because he doesn't have any other additional abilities other than it being a big creature, I would say this is probably a cut as well. And then we have the Silent Spider. It's a 5 mana 4/4. Enters the battlefield, exile target card other than a basic land card from an opponent's graveyard. Search that player's graveyard, hand, library for any number of cards with the same name, exile them, then that player shuffles for as long as we control this. We can play one of those exiled cards and spend mana or any mana of any ability to cast it. Not a bad card, kind of expensive. You know, it's yet again, you know, if you want to keep it, you can keep it, but you know, it itself doesn't have ninjutsu, and the only card that we have that would give it ninjutsu is Umizawa, which is definitely something you could keep if you get, you know, enough copies. But in my final version of this deck, I actually don't play a lot of Umizawas, so it's definitely one of those things that I would say I would probably cut just because right now it's a little bit expensive for what we're trying to do with the deck. So I'm probably gonna move it to the pile over here. But like I said, if you want to keep it, you can definitely go ahead and keep it because it's not a bad card overall. It just doesn't fit with the way I built the deck when it comes to making the edits and updates. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move Hero's Downfall over here just because, you know, it's a card that you probably want to keep. It's a card you probably don't want to keep. And there's definitely some, you know, possibilities of what you can do differently. But I'm just going to move the Hero's Downfall out of the way. just because I do think with the upgrades we could, be okay when it comes to cards. So, we do have a bunch of cards. I am just going to go ahead and just quickly delete them. I think the easiest way to do that is just to do this, drag them up. And then the mana base, I would say the easiest way to upgrade it for the most part, and this really depends on you, is you probably want to make sure you have 4 copies of this. And other than that, you probably either want to keep your waterfront districts for a little bit of that card draw in the late game, as the deck has a little bit of card draw but doesn't have a ton, or you can cut your dismal backwaters as well. So you go up 3, you probably -3, and maybe just kind of go a 2, 4, 1, and then the 9 islands, 8 swamps. So not bad there. The other thing you could do is, if we wanted to, with the lands, if we just go quickly ahead here, do this, and we just kind of scroll to the right because they're weirdly organized. One other thing I want to do, well, you know what, never mind. Oh crap, it actually reset. Okay, let's try this again. Let's just do this. Let's just filter this just so it's the only 4 more recent sets. If we're looking to build this for the future, we want to only use cards that are going to be around in the future. So one card that you could add to the deck, maybe a copy or 2 of, is something like an Ottawa Sorin City. It's a legendary land, so you can only have 1 of them out on the battlefield, but it does have a channel ability for 4 mana that we can bounce something back to its owner's hand, and it costs 1 less if we have for each legendary creature we have. So this is definitely something you may want to add. As well as you can probably add a Takenuma, another good card for the deck, as it is something that can mill 3 cards from our library, then we return a creature card or a planeswalker card from the graveyard to our hand, and itself also costs 1 less for each legendary a creature we have on the battlefield, each legendary we have on the battlefield, I should say. So planeswalkers actually count. So definitely those are 2 cards, probably cut 1 and 1. So definitely I feel like the mana base is pretty much in a good spot. So now what we need to do is we need to actually add in cards that, have ninjutsu. So one of the things I do think is very good is just to kind of you just kind of do like ninja or something really short, so you can just get all the cards that have ninjutsu. In the main deck, the one thing I would probably go ahead and do is I probably make sure I have 4 copies of Thousand Face Shadow. It's a great card. I don't know if you know what it does, but essentially it's a 1/1 for 1, so it also has flying, which is amazing. So it's good in the early game. And then in the late game, once you kind of have it out, maybe get a couple things snuck out on the battlefield, you can then bounce it back to your hand and then ninjutsu itself back on the battlefield. And when you do that, it enters the battlefield from our hand, and it's attacking, create a token that's a copy of another attacking creature. That token enters the battlefield tapped and also attacking, so it kind of puts more pressure on your opponent. So definitely a card you want probably 4 copies of, because it's a really good 1-drop in general, and it's an amazing card that you could have in the late game. Outside of that, you probably want to play like 3 copies of Fate and Hope. You probably want to play 4 copies of Network Disruptor, 1 maybe additional copy of March of the Shadows. Probably want 4 copies of our Fur Master. We probably want 2 copies of Silencer. Sorry, I'm actually looking at my list as I'm kind of doing this because I have it on the other screen that I kind of built. The other thing you want to probably do here is we probably want 1 additional copy of this, 1 additional copy of Kaito. Vita-Palm Ninja is a very strong card. We probably want 4 copies of this because we can remove the menace counter from it and actually get addition. We can make our opponent exile a card from their hand. Prosperous Thief, I think that's a card we probably want 1 more copy of. So now we're sitting at 54 cards, which is definitely very good. I would say the one thing you probably want to do here as well with the deck is you probably want to grab another 1-drop that has some sort of flying, because we want to make sure we hit that 1-drop, because that 1-drop is going to be very important in this process, because this is going to allow us to get evasive early on, because there's not going to be many things that our opponents going to be able to play early on that has evasive. So if we're in a rotation standard, a good card could be something like a Lantern's Bearer. It's just a 1-mana 1/1, which is all we really need. Before that, I would say I think they played the Rogue, that essentially every time it deals damage to an opponent, they mill a card, and then if you have 8 or more creatures, you sacrifice it, but that card's rotating. So I would say, Lantern Bearer is an okay replacement. It's not amazing, but it's, it does the job of just being an evasive creature. Next card up, and it's a surprising card they didn't actually have it in here. Let me just type ninjutsu again. The one thing I was surprised they didn't actually have in here was actually the Prowler in the starter deck. So the Prowler is definitely very good. It enters the battlefield. Target creature control gets death touch and lifelink at end turn. So Cool combat trick. Definitely, you can give it to itself and, get 3 damage in and gain 3 life. So not bad there. Probably want a couple copies of that. And then the last card, and I guess, it's one of those things that they don't, they only give you so many rares and so many mythics, is Nashi, I should say, Moonsage Scion. It's a 3-mana 3/2, Ninjas to a 4. When it deals combat damage to a player, we get the exile top card of each player's library, and then until end of turn, you may play one of those cards. If you cast a spell this way, you can pay life rather than its mana cost. So definitely a good way to kind of use your opponent's cards against them. So definitely a great card to add to the deck, and that really is just the deck. I mean, it's not really anything super crazy. I mean, it's kind of, you can kind of see the more so starter deck of it, but you definitely can see that it's not really too many pieces. And most of these pieces are from Kamigawa, and they don't rotate. There's a couple pieces that may feel a little odd, like the Lantern Bearer. But other than that, this deck is definitely going to be pretty solid, I think. I do think, like, this is a deck that, like I said, is possibly upgradable. You don't have to do this all at once. I would say if you're going to replace, when it comes to, like, how to figure out what to replace if you're going over a thing, the one thing I would probably start with, you probably want to replace what's in the deck. So, upgrade the things that, the deck already includes. So, you only have 3 copies of this. You want to make sure you have 4 copies. You want to make sure you have, 4 copies of this. You want to make sure you have Lantern Bearer. So, or not Lantern Bearer. You want to make sure you have 4 copies of Network Disruptor. Upgrade those cards, and then as you go on, you probably want to, if you're going to add one of these, cut another 3-drop from the deck. Cut another more expensive card from the deck. Cut a creature from the deck if you're going to add that. If you want to add another Kaito, I'd say, remove one of the enchantments from the deck. Removal, you could probably replace a Hero's Downfall. But overall, this is definitely a deck that sets you up in the right spot. This is a deck that you can work towards when rotation does happen. Doesn't have to be something you have to do today with the deck. But definitely, I do think this deck could be a good deck. And it's great that, you get to use a base of a starter deck and kind of work from that and work your way outward. And then you can always mess around and kind of see what works for you and what doesn't. If you want that 5-drop rare that I removed from the deck, you can always keep that in the deck. If you don't want Kaitos in the deck and want maybe more Satoras or Satoru, if you want to, make sure you can kind of like cast that 5-drop maybe for less mana, go ahead and do it. It's definitely one of those things we don't really know what's going to happen in the next standard, but definitely Stealthy Subterfuge could be a deck that could be reckoned with when it comes to upgrading it in the next standard. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Gruul Werewolves, or the On the Hunt starter deck. And I do think, yet again, this is another deck that is, lined up to be a pretty decent deck when rotation does happen for a new player. And then when you upgrade this deck, it does get better, I think, overall. And I do think Werewolves will be a deck that will exist in the meta. It was at one point kind of one of the decks you saw a lot of, maybe around when Innistrad and Crimson Vow came out. We get back into that more limited standard, and there are a lot of wolves and werewolves, even though this does lose a few cards from the current wolves and werewolves in the older sets. It does have a lot of areas that it can still improve upon, to be a still solid deck regardless. But definitely a good deck, I do think. It's definitely a nice aggro deck. It definitely has some good cards even in it. I do think a card like Helena and Helena Partners is definitely a great card, as it gives target creature, we have plus X +1/+1 counters, where X is the power of Helena and Helena, and hasten to end of turn, so it makes that card attack in immediately. Stormseeker is great, as it is a 2/3 that you can give itself its own ability to make it a 3/3, and it can attack it immediately because it gives it haste as well. And if it flips over, it gives that creature now +2/+0 and trample and haste into end of turn. You got Tolvar, which syncs well with all our werewolves. Whenever a wolf or a werewolf with control deals damage to a player, we get to draw a card, and at the end of our upkeep, if we control 3 or more werewolves, transforms and becomes night. And then you get the whole other ability, which we still can draw the card, and then you get to have a mana sink, which you pump up a creature and give it trample to end of turn. But overall, this deck is pretty solid. I do think this is another cool deck that they definitely picked out for you. A deck that's easily upgradable. There's definitely some cards in here that, it's going to be kind of a wait and see, just because when we lose some of the cards in the 2-drop slot, it's going to be like, what is that card that's going to replace those cards? So the one thing I'm going to do is kind of pull out some cards, just like I did in the previous deck, and that I feel like they're cool, but I would say they're more of a limited kind of thing. So the one thing being is like a Wolf Strike. It's a fight spell that gives target creature +2/+0 if it's night. So a very, situational that is probably more than likely not going to happen in a standard. It's kind of expensive, and you have to make sure it's night really to get that +2/+0. So it's just a fight spell for 3 at the end of the day, which is kind of not great. We really don't need a ton of ramp, I don't think, as much as this kind of helps this ramp. I think a 3-mana 2/3 is not great, even though it becomes a 3/4 and produces 2. Howlin' Moon's an interesting card. Definitely a card maybe you'll see play, but I'm not really a fan, even though it's a card that works well with this. So definitely interesting. Definitely taxes your opponent if they cast multiple spells, if that becomes a thing in the next standard. Maybe we'll see that happen, but I could see a couple connive cards, being good with this. But we lose the Magecraft deck, so I don't know if that card's gonna be amazing. I know it's a rare. You can keep it in if you want to, but it's definitely something I would cut. Reckless Stormseeker we keep. Moon Rager Slash. Okay, 3 mana, 3 damage to any target. Costs 2 less if it's nighttime. But very situational. A 3 mana, 3 damage instant speed is kind of rough, especially in an aggressive meta. Don't know if the meta is going to be aggressive, but I do think this is kind of one of those cards that has good upside, but it's definitely situational, and more than likely is going to cost you 3 mana at most situations. So probably a cut there just because it's expensive. Hungry Werewolf is definitely a good card, though I would say we probably want to trim down a little bit in our 2-drop slot, as I don't think we need a ton of 2-drops. So we really want to be like more of that mid-range aggro style deck where we have a nice 3 to 4 mana pocket with this deck. I do think is kind of where it works. So we're going to cut the Ridgewolves as much as they could work. You can keep them in overall, but I'm just going to cut them for now, just because what I upgrade is kind of like the 3 creatures that we essentially have here. We'll get rid of the Unnatural Moonrise. I do think it's an okay card, but it's kind of like a trick you have to play face up, so you really can't surprise your opponent by making it nighttime and surprising them. So I do think as much as it's a cool card and works well with werewolves, I just think it's kind of one of those things that it's a face up trick. Lunar Frenzy, another cool card, decent mana sink. First Strike and Trample is awesome, but I do think this is yet again a more limited card, so we're going to cut that one. Snarling Wolf, it's an okay 1-drop that gets bigger, though you have to sink mana into it every turn. You can only activate it once. So yet again, another card that could be good and limited, but doesn't feel like it's going to do well in more of a constructed format. Going into the 4-drop slot, we have Fangblade Brigard. It's like uncommon. It's a 3/4 for 4. We can tap 2 mana, give it First Strike, and +1/+0 into end of turn. And if it flips over, it gets an ability that pumps our team. Yet again, mana sink, but we want to make sure we're playing creatures that we can, keep up with our opponent. And I do think there's other cards in this slot we want to make sure we have additional copies of, so this kind of gets the cut because of that. Howlpack Piper is another interesting card. It's a card that can't be countered. We can tap 2, tap it, and put a creature card from the onto the battlefield from our hand. If it's a wolf or werewolf, we get to untap it and possibly do it again. And then the flip side is kind of weird, because when it transforms, we get to look at the top 6 cards of our library. We can reveal a creature card among them, put into our hand, put the rest in the bottom in our library in any random order. So the front side's actually better than the back side. So I feel like if we want to be on the back side for a werewolf deck, we don't probably want this card in the deck as much as it's going to cheat out creatures from our hand onto the battlefield, because the reverse side is really not that great and doesn't work well with the deck. So definitely probably a cut there. After that, we have Child of the Pack. It's a 4 mana 2/5 that we can tap 4 mana. We get a green wolf token. And then on the flip side, it makes all our other creatures +1/+0, and itself is a 5/5 trampler. Nice limited card because it blocks well, but not really good constructed card, so probably cut there. Burly Breaker is definitely good. 6/5 for Ward 1 with Daybound, and then it has Ward 3, and it's an 8/7. Nice big creature, but just doesn't, it's one of those things, as good as it is, it's kind of vanilla. We need things with more like impactful effects, so it's probably a cut. Village Watch, it's a 5 mana 4/3 with haste. And then Wolves and Werewolves you control have haste. Yet again, good card in limited, but not really good card, I would say, in constructed, just because of 5 mana 4/3, you'd want more value out of it, and unfortunately has good upside in limited, but it doesn't have good upside in a standard kind of setting. So definitely a lot of cards that will be cut from the deck and doesn't leave you too much room to really have a deck. So what I'm going to just do is kind of cut all these cards out as I did before. All right, so we cut out 25 cards from the deck. There's a lot of cards in the deck that we'll want to upgrade, so the one thing we probably want to do is look at our 2-drop slot. We probably want to go like a balance of 3 and 3. The Consigue Naturalist is definitely a great card for the deck, as it itself is a card that ramps up, and then when it's nighttime, it makes all our other creatures that much bigger, so that's a card we probably want 4 of. Tolvar is a good creature. We want 3 copies of that. Probably don't want a fourth copy because it is legendary, but 3 is probably good enough there. Reckless Stormseeker is not legendary. That's a great card to have 4 copies of. Helena and Helena Partners, another great card, is legendary. Probably want 3 copies because it is legendary. 4 copies is kind of pushing it, because if you have one in your hand, you already have a Helena and Helena out. You're not going to be able to cast both of them. You get both triggers. And then Arlen Pack's Hope is another great card. It's a great planeswalker, puts wolves on the battlefield. It allows us to play, creatures from our hand as if they had flash and give them additional +1/+1, or we just create 2 wolves. And then on the nighttime side, we can make her a 5/5 indestructible creature with indestructible and haste. So good card there. So that is what we have out of the main deck, and now we just kind of have to fill out the rest of the deck. And the one thing I will say is that we need a little bit of removal, or a little bit of spot removal, and I do think Play with Fire is actually a good card. compared to any of the other 1 mana damage spells, just because you can do to player as well as a creature or planeswalker or anything as any target essentially. So we will probably want 4 copies of that, and if we do to a player, we get to get the Scry, which is definitely very good. Another card that's going to be very good, especially you're going to see it a lot in probably standard in decks that play red, is going to be Kumano, just because it's a great card for aggro deck. It helps us actually because not only does it deal 1 damage on turn 1 to a player and the planeswalker they control, the creature we play on turn 2 could possibly get a +1/+1 counter. So all these creatures now come to the battlefield as an additional +1/+1, which is good. And on top of that, we get a 2/2 creature on turn 3. Still have mana open. And then any creature that would get dealt damage this turn by a sorcery control would die exile instead. So, it's a creature at the end of the day and has a lot of value for being a 1-drop. So definitely awesome there. Outside of that, we probably want some of these because this is going to be the other card that's going to be really popular in red, I would say, in decks that play it, which is a, Fable Mirror Breaker. It's a great card. It's not a werewolf. It doesn't produce a werewolf, but we can create a 2/2 red goblin shaman that whenever it attacks, we get a treasure. We can discard up to 2 cards at the beginning of our upkeep on chapter 2. We have to draw that many cards instead. And then on chapter 3, we get a 2/2 reflection of Kiki Jiki that essentially we can copy another non-legendary creature we control, except it has haste, and at the beginning of the upkeep, sacrifice it. So it allows us to be even more aggressive, which is definitely awesome. And then the last card we want to add is going to be the Volatile Arsonist. It's a 5. It's another great mythic, I would say, that's great for werewolves. It's a 5 mana 4/4 with menace and haste, so it has to have 2 blockers in order to block it. Then whenever it attacks, it deals 1 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target player, and up to 1 target planeswalker. So definitely good there. The flip side's even better. It deals 2 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, 1 target player, and or 1 target planeswalker. So it does it to 3 different targets if it does go through. It's putting additional pressure even if it doesn't actually hit. If they throw some chump blockers in front of it, and then the flip side, it makes it even bigger with the same effect. So definitely a good card. And I just realized I'm at 61, so I messed up somewhere because I followed my list and I have 1 extra card. I figured it out. It's actually in the mana base. So the one thing I will say is we want to go down to probably 2 Rugged Highlands. We want to go up to 4 copies of Rockvale. We want to go down to 0 copies. I do think this is probably the way you want to go. You are the aggro deck. You want to make sure you have cards in hand. We do have some card draw in the deck, but I do think having a land that we can sacrifice and just get a draw effect is definitely better. Then gaining 1 life. But yet again, if you want the 1 life, you can replace the Racer's Ring with the Rockvale Gorge. So definitely, another good list. I do think Werewolves is going to be a deck that will be very popular very early, just because it has a lot of pieces, and it's really all built around Innistrad for the most part, which makes it very versatile deck. And there's a lot of pieces in it that came out of, like, say, Kamigawa, like the Fable Mirror Breaker and Kumano, that I do think makes it that much better, even though it loses a little bit in the 2-drop slot. But overall, it's still a very good deck. Definitely another deck I do think it's worth upgrading to get to something like this, get ready for rotation. And with that out of the way, let's go to the last deck. So the last deck up on the list is the Ignite the Forge deck, which essentially to me is Rakdos Anvil, just because it does play Anvil. So it is a deck that plays around artifacts. I've previously built this deck on my free-to-play account. I have a version of it on my main account. So it is a deck that is near and dear to my heart because I do enjoy this style of deck. It is a very nice mid-rangey deck. It did kind of lose a little bit of steam, I think, in the current meta, just because there are things that can trample over a lot of things here, but it does very well at draining your opponent. So I do think it's a deck that you want to probably play when it comes to if you're looking for that kind of maybe more that mid-rangey. It's not really a control deck, it's not really an aggro deck, it's just kind of like a mid-range kind of drain deck is kind of the best way to describe it. And it's definitely a kind of deck style I do enjoy. And there's a lot of pieces in here that you can see from the Rakdos Anvil deck. If you've seen me play it before, that definitely are very good. You have your Harvester, you have your Anvil, you have your Smelter, you have your Reactor, you have your Surge, you have your Synthesizer. There's a few other cards in here that, to me, that don't really work, but it's definitely, something you can do and slowly build over time. I mean, having artifacts in the deck are very good. So if you're going to cut anything and you're cutting an artifact, you want to make sure you have an artifact to replace it. Right off the bat, I'm just going to kind of go through and kind of look at cards and kind of remove them. So like Blood Fountain's okay. We're not going to be getting a ton of creatures in the graveyard, so the secondary ability other than creating a blood token and it being an artifact is something that we're not going to really need, and we probably want to replace it with more synthesizers. So Blood Fountain's a cut. Surge is good. Ceremonial Knife, you know, we're not really the aggro deck. We could put it on a creature, gain some blood tokens, but we're not really an aggro deck, so I feel like Ceremonial Knife is not very good for the deck. Removal is okay. You know, having some sort of spot removal is good, but I do think there's another card that isn't an Infernal Grasp that works much better for our deck, and we don't lose life in the process, so I do that. Virus Beetle is a great 2-drop in the deck. You know, definitely something you could play if you wanted to, because itself is an artifact creature, though it does cost black mana, makes your opponent discard a card. But yet again, you know, we're making sure we want to make sure we have the slots to get like our additional anvils and other creatures in the deck. Bloodcaster, yet again, awesome card. But with the way we're going to mold the deck, if you haven't seen me do this before, Bloodcaster, you know, as cool as it is, I just don't think it works for the deck, because as much as we're sacrificing creatures, we can get blood tokens every time we sacrifice a you know, one of our 1/1, you know, artifact creatures, and get a blood token out of it. Definitely something we could do. Actually, never mind. It's non-token. I read the card wrong. So we're not going to get additional blood tokens out of our creatures that we're sacrificing, like aka our artifact creatures. So this is probably a card that just doesn't work, because really we're focused around sacrificing artifacts or artifact creatures. So we're not going to get some additional blood tokens there, even though it is a cool card for other things in our deck. Smelter's good. Animal's good. Harvester's good. Forebearer, yet again, we're not producing a ton of blood tokens in our deck. So its secondary ability is not great, but I do think that the only thing that's good about it is that when it attacks in, it makes us get a blood token. But yet again, a card, as I don't think vampires outside of Blood Tithe Harvester really work with the deck when we create the blood tokens. Facebreaker's interesting, because whenever one of our more creatures deal combat damage to play, we get to create a treasure token, and then we can sacrifice those treasures, which allows us to exile top card of our library. Essentially, it's kind of like drawing a card and be able to possibly play that card. Yet again, I do think it kind of is cool, but I do think there's other things we could add in the 3-drop slot. But you could play it if you want to, because you know, we have the Smelter that can, you know, create a 3/1 with haste that possibly do damage. But I'm gonna cut it as well. It just, to me, it doesn't work with like the way I would see this deck going come rotation. Scrap Wielder's interesting as well. It's a 3-mana 3/3. You can sacrifice an artifact with mana value X, return an artifact with mana value X or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, and it gains haste. We're not really, a lot of our artifacts are more so tokens, because, you know, as much as these creatures are here, we're not returning other artifacts. So I would say Scrap Wielder probably gets the boot as well. But yet again, that's just me. We could, you know, sacrifice an artifact with mana value 2 and get back an artifact with mana value 2, which is kind of weird. I don't really know. You would not really want to sacrifice an anvil to get back a reactor and vice versa. Circuit Mender, good card. I just, you know, it's a little expensive. I do think that the overall deck curve of the deck version I have, you know, the mana curve is much lower. Companion, yet again, the spirit tokens it makes aren't artifacts. Itself is an artifact, but those creatures don't really do anything for us. Big Score is not bad because it does get a lot of mana. Though we're not really trying to dig and discard and kind of do stuff like that. Though it do get 2 treasure tokens out of it. Not really something I'm feeling that would work well in the deck. The Twin Shot Snipers, yet again, cool card, 2 damage to any target, but I don't know. You'd probably rather play. I personally would rather play With Fire because it costs 1 to do the same thing. I know it's an artifact creature, though. I don't think the upside for playing a 4-mana artifact creature to get the benefit of Anvil is definitely there. So definitely it's probably something I'd cut. Atushi Blazing Sky is definitely another cool card. It's not an artifact creature. Doesn't produce any artifacts other than when it dies, and we don't really have an outlet to sacrifice it. So I do think it's kind of a clunky card for the deck in general. As you kind of see, I'm just kind of gutting the deck and kind of making it into like a Rakdos Anvil deck I've played before. Dollhouse of Horrors is definitely interesting. This is kind of one of those things that I do see like this card could see play, though I don't think it plays well in a sacrifice deck because we're not really sacrificing creatures or sacrificing artifacts, and this really only takes creatures out of the graveyard to make copies of them. So I do think that's probably a cut, as much as, you know, you may like that card. I just don't think it works for what, you know, an Anvil deck wants to do. So a lot of cards coming out of the deck. You know, it's definitely one of those things I do think, you know, you have to kind of take out the cards that are okay but don't really work. I don't know why the Ceremonial Knife won't go. I guess the game doesn't like me. Okay, there we go. I guess I have to drag it into the right area. Try to go too quick. So yet again, just like the last time, not really left with a bunch, but there's definitely a lot of good things here that I do think that we want to keep. We want more additional copies of Voltage Surge because that's a card that works very good in our deck because we are producing like blood tokens, we are possibly producing treasure tokens, so we want to make sure we have ways to do big damage by sacrificing our artifacts to get 4 damage to something. Synthesizer is another good card that we want to have, you know, make sure we have card draw in effect. This card itself, you know, gets this card when it comes on the battlefield. It gets this card when it leaves the battlefield. We can sacrifice it as well if we don't have a way to sacrifice it with by paying 3 mana and get a token out of it. So definitely good there. Reactor's kind of like the cool card to play, though it is something that you may want to play out of if you are trying to go more of with like Ob Nixilis and stuff. And I do think that's kind of the way I'm leaning with this deck overall. So I do think like, this card, as much as I would play it as a good way to finish off our opponent, it is kind of a card that takes some time to build up. Smelter is definitely a good card. I do think that you want to make sure you have in the deck. There's also like, you can, yet again, if you don't have a ton of artifacts, this is making us sacrifice artifacts. We may not have sacrifice. So for now, we're gonna cut it, though it is another option if that's the route you want to go. 4 anvils is a must. 4 harvesters is a must. Other cards we can add into the deck. I've actually, this card has actually grown on me, especially for this deck, and that card is going to be eaten alive, as it's a great card for our deck because it's a 1 mana removal that we can sacrifice a creature instead of paying the additional 4, and then we exile a creature or planeswalker. So I do think that's great removal. To me, that kind of feels like this deck's version of Blood Chief's Thirst, and we don't actually have to, sacrifice anything that we really, other than a token, which could produce another token, is definitely pretty good, I think, overall for the deck. Another card that I do think is going to be good in the deck is this card. I like how it's giving me white cards. It's going to be Unlucky Witness. I think this is going to be a great card. It in itself is a card draw card. It's 1 mana 1/1 that when it dies, exile top 2 cards of our library until our next end step. We can play one of those cards. So a good card to kind of chump block and then get a little bit of card draw and then get the card draw for your turn. So it's like a draw. It's like a way to draw 2, play 1 kind of card. So definitely I feel like works well, even though there's not any good way to really sacrifice it. It's definitely a card I do think that's going to see a lot of play as well in like these kind of like grindy style decks. Another card that's going to be really good, I think, in this style deck as well, is going to be the Underdog. I do think it's a card that may not be, we're not going to play a ton of them, but having at least 2 copies of it, I think is going to be good in the deck because it is a 2 mana 3/2, which is amazing. And then if we blitz it in, if it dies early on, we can always blitz it. And when we sacrifice, we get a card draw out of it, which is definitely good and allows us to keep aggressive. And if we gain enough life, we should hopefully be okay there. Another card that I'm very surprised they didn't actually add to the deck that I feel like works very well is the Epicure. It's a 1 mana 1/1. Itself creates a blood token. It also pings your opponent for 1 damage at the beginning of the game if you get it on turn 1. So I think it's an amazing card as well for the deck. Outside of that I don't have. This is a card that you're going to see a lot of in Standard, especially in the rotation Standard, because a lot of removal gets rid of. And that card's going to be Meat Hook Massacre. I think that's a card that you want to make sure you have for the deck, as it is a card that will see a ton of play as well. And then the last card that I don't have in the deck that I do think is kind of be like the new way we're going to be able to sacrifice things, not just artifacts, but also things in our deck outside of, that is going to be the Fellstinger. That's a card that I do think is going to be interesting here overall. It's not a Deadly Dispute. It's not going to be able to, give you a treasure. It's not going to draw you 2 cards at the cost of sacrificing a creature or artifact. But it's going to be able to exploit a creature you have. So it can exploit like your Epicure. It can exploit your Witness. And essentially for paying 2 life, you get to draw 2 cards. And you get a 3/2 Death Toucher, which I think kind of works for the deck. And outside of that, I think that's everything. Why do I feel like yet again I'm off again with my numbers? I completely forgot that I was playing this card in the deck because the way the website that I use for I post my decks has it organized all the way in the bottom. So the other card I think is going to be good for this deck because we want to make sure we're also putting pressure on our opponent is going to be Ob Nixilis. Just because one, you can sacrifice like a Harvester, you go sacrifice an Underdog. You get a 3 loyalty token version of Ob Nixilis. You can even sacrifice a 1 mana creature or the artifact. Get another artifact out of it, and just have two Ob Nixilises here that can put pressure on your opponent's hand, can put a double token out, giving you a little bit of life. Definitely good there. When it comes to lands, we don't need all these lands because the deck is very low to the curve. So you probably want to go down to like seven mountains. You probably want to go down to like 6 swamps, which is puts us a little lower. But we're gonna add in some copies of Haunted Ridge, which is gonna be like a good card for the deck. I do think you don't need the Bloodfell Caves. I think the Tramway Stations are good. And then the other thing I would probably add to the deck is going to be... All right, and there is like my upgraded version of the Ignite the Forge deck. Yet again, I know it's kind of more of a drastic, different version of the deck, but I do think in its core that deck is essentially an Anvil deck. Is this version going to be the deck of the only Anvil deck you're going to see in like a post-rotation standard? It may possibly, you know, yet again, all these decks are still speculative. But I do think like out of those, it's proven that these 3 decks work. This deck works. Gruul Werewolves works. Even Dimir Ninjas works, even though the overall rating of the deck isn't super high when it comes to overall win rate. But it's still a deck that is very viable when you go to a more limited card pool. A lot of decks that work around mechanics are very good, and if it has a lot of cards that, you know, emphasize that mechanic, it makes it that much better. But definitely, you know, I would say, you know, if you're gonna want to upgrade some starter decks, I would start with these 3. There are versions of these decks that include cards that are currently in standard that are going to rotate out that you can look at for other guidance if you want to add those cards. If you want to build them towards, you know, eventually, you know, like rotation proof decks, you can go with the ones I have. I'll have all these linked down in the description below if you want to go ahead and copy them in, kind of see how far you're off from them. But for the most part, with all these decks, I know I kind of like took piles of it and moved it off to the side. But if you're gonna, you know, remove a creature from the deck to get another creature in, that's kind of the best way to do it. Look at the mana curve of cards. So if you're gonna add, you know, add in a 3-cost card, that's one of the ones I recommended. Remove a 3-cost card. I hope this video helps in a way. I'll probably look back at these starter decks once rotation happens, just because there's no way for me really to play test them in a way that makes sense, just because all these decks only include cards from the last 4 sets, so it's kind of hard to play test against decks that they really won't be playing against in the next standard. But with that out of the way, you know, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.